Good morning, team. Hope you're well. And I'm happy that we are here again to pick the book of Corinthians as we study and see the reasons why Paul wrote this letter. And therefore, when we were ending the other time, I just gave the background of the city of Corinth, where it was located, the population, the kind of people that lived there, and we also said that it was a port of entry of the city of Corinth. Therefore, so many businesses were happening there. And when we were ending, we said, as we quoted Romans chapter 12, verse 2, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And when we ended, we said, although the church was meant to influence their world, it was the other way around. The world entered into the church. And therefore, today, I'm going to pick from there and we will get moving. So, the introduction to 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians was written during the third missionary journey of Paul at Ephesus, where he stayed for 3 years. And that we will find it in Acts chapter 18, Acts chapter 19, Acts chapter 15, chapter 16, and chapter 20. We will read these scriptures as we go on. Now we just want to do the introduction, but then we will get into the foundation of this book as we continue. So Paul had received information from several sources, among them the household of Chloe. They did not hide problems, they told the pastor. If they could not have told the pastor, then Paul, their pastor, could not have known what was going on in the church of Corinth and in the setup in the church of Corinthians. And as we had said, the world had entered into the church. So the house of Chloe got concerned because now things were getting out of hand in the church of Corinthians. So concerning the problems existing in the church at Corinth, that's why Chloe, the household of Chloe, wrote this letter to Paul. So the problems were undermining the effectiveness of their witness in Corinth and the vitality of their faith. So the problems were too much. The world had gotten into the church. And so the household of Chloe, who are part and parcel of this church, got concerned. And because they got concerned, they remembered their pastor and they wrote a letter to Paul. So when we come to the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul is just replying to the letter that he received from the household of Chloe. And at times, friend, it is good when you see that there is a problem in the setup of the church where you are. It is always good to share it with the person who are concerned so that these issues will be straightened out and the curve will be leveled. So these were the problems that Paul was dealing with when he wrote the letter, and they were classified in 4 categories. Let us pick them. Number 1, there was divisions in the church. When we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10, and also chapter 14, which we'll read later on, the division is made up of 4 different groups. Some followed Apollos, some followed Paul, some followed Peter, and some others were following Christ. So we find that there was division in the church. Some people said that they belonged to Paul, others Apollos, others Peter, and others followed Christ. So there are divisions in the church. And therefore, when Paul was writing this letter, he was telling them, now, why do we have divisions in the church? And therefore, we will go and read the divisions that were going on at that time. Again, number 2, the thing that now again he was talking about these problems, there was defilement in the church. Chapter 4 and chapter 6, there was defilement in the church. The church was struggling with unbelievable and serious cases of immorality. One particular case is highlighted about a man who had taken his father's wife. And therefore, this one brought defilement in the church. And when we were starting with the introduction, we said this defilement came about when now people were coming into the church with their culture, with their traditions, with their beliefs from outside there. And therefore, immorality got into the church, so much so that a man had taken his father's wife. And when I was doing the introduction, I had said that this particular man that has taken in his father's wife is just like this wife was still young. So when this man saw his father's wife was young, he started showing some interest in this woman. And therefore, the church started to be defiled, and it was so bad. So that is the reason again why Paul wrote this letter. Again, number 3, there were difficulties in this church, and difficult issues arose that required wisdom to handle. We will pick it from chapter number 7 to chapter number 13. The church asked Paul to offer pastoral wisdom on how to handle the difficulties they faced related to the following. And as we had mentioned earlier, all these letters were coming from the house of Chloe. So they wanted Paul to talk about and to handle the issues about marriage in chapter 7. Members had questions about whether or not to get married or stay single, and questions about divorce. Number 2, they also wanted Paul to talk about Christian liberty, that he also did in chapter 8 to 11. Corinthians needed direction on how their exercise of Christian liberty affected their fellow church members. Again, they wanted Paul to address the issue of spiritual gifts. Directions were needed on how to use spiritual gifts in the church. And Paul picked it from chapter 12 to chapter 14. Paul again addressed the issue of resurrections that had so many questions, and that he addressed in chapter 15. A right teaching was needed in relation to the subject of the resurrection of the saints. Again, Paul addressed the issue of offerings in chapter number 16. So all these instructions were needed on how to handle collections that were given for the Jerusalem church. And also, as we look at our setup today, there are so many questions at times about offerings, about tithings, and things concerning giving in the church. So Paul wrote this letter to instruct and to correct the church in relation to the positions they needed to take to deal with the issues of division, defilement, and also to give his input in helping them handle the issues before them. And so the Apostle Paul was also concerned about the people in this church, that he had to write one of the most practical of all his letters, advising the Corinthians to apply spiritual wisdom to their worldly problems. So the issues raised by the Corinthians to Paul were social, domestic, doctrinal. These are the same issues that today's church, whether Pentecostal, Episcopal, Western, Eastern, or African, wherever it may be, these is the issues that we are dealing with in this time in the church. And therefore, he addressed them in the book of Corinthians. So, 1 Corinthians can be outlined as follows. First, he started with greetings. And you'll notice that all the letters of Paul, he always started with greetings. And this one we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1 to 3, he started with greetings. And when we pick them, because now I'm still summarizing 1 Corinthians, we will read the greetings that Paul brought to them. Number 2, there was reproof, the report of sin in the church that we are going to pick in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 4 to 6. Then again, as we continue, chapter 6, verse 20. And in chapter 1, there is division in the church that is addressing, discipline in the church in chapter 5, disputes in the courts, that because now the believers had reached a place now, because the church could not handle their questions and sort them out, they decided to go to court. Chapter 6, 1 to 8. Again, there was defilement in the world, in their world at that particular time. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 to 20. Then we come to instruction, the reply to their questions. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and again, chapter 16, verse 12. And here, he addresses marriage, chapter 7, food offered to idols. That will be a very interesting topic when we reach there. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 to chapter 10, church ordinances. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, wow, that is another interesting topic that you will not want to miss. Spiritual gifts, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 1 to 14, chapter 12, the whole of chapter 12, then chapter 14 will also capture the spiritual gifts. And you also notice that in this church, though the world has gotten into it, the spiritual gifts were overflowing in this church. Wow. And Paul now is going to teach them how to handle these spiritual gifts and put things in order in the church. Again, when he's giving instruction, he's talking about the resurrection. People are asking about the resurrection. That is in chapter number 15. The offerings, chapter number 16, verse 1 to 12. And then we are going to pick the conclusion from chapter number 16, verse 13 to 24. Friends, this is a very, very important letter that Paul wrote to the church of Corinth. And we will find that this letter that answered all these questions in the book of Corinthians is still answering those questions even now in the Church of Jesus Christ, now and currently. So this outline will be followed in the exposition of the letter. The message of 1 Corinthians shows that God's wisdom applied to worldly problems produces supernatural results. Again, the Christians in Corinth prided themselves in their spiritual gifts and knowledge, yet something was radically wrong with their personal lives and with their local assembly. Again, Paul had what they needed, true spiritual wisdom, not the wisdom of the world, but the wisdom that comes only from God. So 1 Corinthians gives 7 areas in which the wisdom of God was and is needed in church life today. So these are areas These areas are part of every church, wherever you found it, you find it, wherever this church is. So we are going to pick from there. And friend, stay here with me, because so many questions are going to be answered. And then you'll realize that many a times we do not read the Bible with the context, with the culture, and we miss it big time. But as we look at the book of Corinthians, you'll realize that these are still the problems that are facing the church of Christ even today. So as we continue, we will learn a lot, and many of our questions will be answered. May God bless you as we walk this journey of the book of Corinthians. Amen.